The late spring of 1940 found Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring sitting in the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin, holding an intelligence report that made him set it down with barely concealed disdain. The document laid out President Roosevelt's request to Congress for an extraordinary expansion of American aircraft production, a bold claim that factories could churn out 50,000 planes each year. Göring's reaction was swift and dismissive. "The Americans are desperate if they think such fantasies will intimidate us," he told his gathered staff. "They understand nothing about real war production. Let them attempt to transform their automobile plants into aircraft factories. They will discover that manufacturing warplanes demands far more than simply running assembly lines." What the Reichsmarshal utterly failed to comprehend was that across the Atlantic, in Detroit specifically, a Danish-born industrialist named William Knudsen was already dismantling this assumption piece by piece. Knudsen, who had stepped down from the presidency of General Motors, now served as Roosevelt's production chief at the remarkable salary of $1 annually. He was orchestrating what would become the most sweeping industrial revolution the world had ever witnessed. The reality would prove staggering. Within just 4 years, American production would not merely match Göring's dismissed target of 50,000 aircraft yearly, it would nearly double it, reaching close to 100,000 planes annually. All while simultaneously supplying military needs across 2 separate theaters of war, spanning opposite sides of the globe. Roosevelt had made his demands known on May 16, 1940, standing before Congress as German panzer divisions tore through France. "I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year," he declared. The declaration was met with widespread doubt, even among America's future allies. America's track record offered little comfort. In 1939 alone, the nation had produced merely 3,611 military aircraft. The Army Air Corps itself had just 1,700 combat planes in its entire inventory, and many of those were already outdated. Yet Roosevelt wanted a 14-fold increase from that baseline. The man tasked with achieving the seemingly impossible was William Knudsen. When pressed about who possessed the skills and determination to pull off such a feat, presidential advisor Bernard Baruch offered a reply that captured the moment's desperation. "First Bill Knudsen," he said. "Second Bill Knudsen. Third Bill Knudsen." Knudsen had walked away from a $300,000 annual salary to dedicate himself to his adopted country, armed with deep knowledge of mass production gained from decades in the automobile industry. He brought those hard-won principles directly into aircraft manufacturing. The transformation started without delay. By December 1941, American factories were rolling out 2,000 military aircraft every single month, a jump of roughly 20 times the output from just 2 years prior. Plans were announced for an enormous bomber manufacturing facility at Willow Run in Michigan, operated by Ford Motor Company. Boeing started expanding its operations in Seattle. Douglas Aircraft began recruiting thousands of new workers. The machinery of American democracy was beginning to rumble awake. The Nazi leadership's contempt for American capabilities stemmed from a poisonous combination of racist ideology and stubborn refusal to see reality clearly. General Friedrich von Berthiger served as the Wehrmacht's military attaché in Washington during the years 1933 to 1941, and he sent back detailed reports about how American industry was mobilizing for war. His December 1940 cable carried an unmistakable warning: American war production will reach unimaginable heights. Berlin's response was to dismiss these cables as the work of a defeatist exaggerating the threat. When Berthiger actually traveled to meet Hitler in February 1939 to discuss American industrial potential, the Führer responded with vicious rants about American racial inferiority, rather than bothering to absorb what his military intelligence was telling him. "Americans are half Judaized, half Negroified," Hitler declared, and therefore incapable of waging effective warfare over any sustained period. This ideological blindness would ultimately cost Germany everything. It corrupted thinking at every level of the military and government. Luftwaffe intelligence officers, upon receiving reports that women were flooding into aircraft factories, interpreted this development not as practical necessity, but as a sign of American desperation and weakness. They operated within a worldview so rigid it could not accommodate the possibility that democratic mobilization might actually exceed what totalitarian command structures could accomplish. When cables arrived describing factories operating 3 shifts continuously, German analysts simply assumed the reports must be exaggerated. The Nazi perspective lacked any framework for understanding what they were actually witnessing. Nowhere was American ambition more evident than at Ford's Willow Run plant. Ground was broken on farmland beginning April 18, 1941, and what emerged was staggering in scope. The finished facility became the largest factory existing under a single roof anywhere on Earth. 3.5 million square feet of manufacturing space with an assembly line that stretched for an entire mile. Charles Sorensen, the man in charge of Ford's production operations, made an audacious promise. His team would construct 1 B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour. Other factories were managing 1 per day. That was the target Sorensen set. Reality initially proved humbling. The first bomber rolled off the line in September 1942, but it arrived so flawed it needed essentially complete reconstruction. Quality failures reached an alarming 50%. By February 1943, the plant was producing just 56 bombers monthly, nowhere near the hundreds of aircraft that had been promised. Cynics started calling it Will It Run, a play on the facility's name, suggesting its promises would never come to fruition. Yet the Ford engineers refused to surrender. They broke down the B-24's massive inventory of 488,193 individual parts into smaller, manageable sub-assemblies. They engineered hydraulic riveting equipment. They fabricated complete wiring harnesses before components reached the main assembly floor. They installed moving assembly lines throughout the facility. Remarkably, they accommodated 578 separate design modifications during 1943 alone, while maintaining continuous production momentum. The breakthrough arrived gradually. By September 1943, monthly output climbed to 148 bombers. December saw that rise to 365. Then came April 1944. That month, Willow Run produced 428 B-24 Liberators, one arriving off the assembly line every 63 minutes, running continuously through every hour of every day. A single factory had now achieved production levels exceeding the entire German aviation industry. German fighter pilots were the first to confront this reality directly. Major Johannes Steinhoff commanded JG-77 Fighter Squadron, and in December 1942, he made an observation that disturbed him deeply. The American pilots are no longer amateurs, he noted in his record. What troubles me most is that there are more of them every single day. This acknowledgement rippled through the Luftwaffe as 1943 unfolded. The Americans mounted their first bombing raid directly against German territory on January 27th, when 64 bombers struck Wilhelmshaven. By October, during what would be remembered as Black Thursday at Schweinfurt, the Americans absorbed the loss of 60 B-17 flying fortresses, yet replaced them entirely within 2 weeks. The mathematical reality had become impossible to deny. During what pilots called Big Week, from February 20th through February 25, 1944, the American 8th and 15th Air Forces coordinated 3,500 separate bomber sorties against German aircraft manufacturing. The Luftwaffe suffered between 262 and 355 fighter losses. More devastating still was the loss of approximately 100 highly experienced veteran pilots, irreplaceable men who possessed years of accumulated combat knowledge. General Adolf Galland brought the numbers to Goering, and they painted a picture of collapse. Germany was losing 1,200 fighters monthly while managing to produce only 1,000 replacements. America, by contrast, was manufacturing 2,500 fighters every month while absorbing losses of just 400. Major Heinz Baer, among Germany's greatest fighter aces with 220 aerial victories to his credit, described a January 1944 mission over Brunswick in terms that captured the helplessness spreading through the Luftwaffe. The bomber stream extended from one horizon to the other, he recounted. I counted at least 700 flying fortresses and liberators. We were 8 fighters flying against hundreds. It was hopeless. The statistics of 1944 reflected American industrial supremacy at its apex. That single year, American factories produced 96,270 aircraft. Within that total were 16,048 four-engine bombers, 35,743 fighters, and 22,591 multi-engine aircraft. This 1 year's manufacturing output surpassed Germany's entire wartime production of approximately 94,677 aircraft across all 6 years of conflict. But the disparity extended beyond raw numbers. Every American bomber carried 13 defensive 50-caliber machine guns, each loaded with thousands of rounds of ammunition. German fighters, by contrast, increasingly took to the air with partial ammunition loads due to shortages. American bombers featured electrically powered gun turrets, advanced bomb sights with remarkable accuracy, and navigation equipment of sophistication the Germans could not match. German fighters, meanwhile, frequently lacked even functioning radios for basic communication. By May 1944, Boeing's Seattle Plant 2 was producing 16 B-17s daily. Douglas Aircraft had grown from employing 68 workers in 1936 to commanding a workforce of 167,000 ton across 9 separate manufacturing facilities. North American Aviation was manufacturing 500 P-51 Mustangs every month. Lockheed achieved the production of 1 P-38 Lightning every 90 minutes, while simultaneously implementing 2,127 separate modifications driven by combat experience. The supporting industries matched this extraordinary tempo. General Motors produced 57,658 aircraft engines operating under license agreements. Packard built 55,523 Rolls-Royce Merlins for American aircraft. Alcoa increased aluminum production by 600% to meet surging demand. Dow Chemicals expanded magnesium output from £6 million annually to £333 million, a 55-fold increase. The transformation of America's labor force shattered every Nazi preconception about democratic societies. In 1941, women comprised less than 1% of the aircraft manufacturing workforce. By 1943, they represented 65%, 310,000 women working across the aircraft industry. At Douglas's Long Beach facility alone, 22,308 of the 41,600 employees were women. Rose Wilman Rowe, who became known as the original Rosie the Riveter, drove 3,000 rivets during each shift at Willow Run, maintaining 99.5% accuracy throughout her work. Women inspectors at Douglas systematically reduced defect rates from 3.2% down to 0.3%, a stunning improvement. Ford engineers redesigned tools specifically for smaller hands, an adaptation that inadvertently boosted overall efficiency. Lighter pneumatic riveting tools reduced worker fatigue, while better positioned workstations decreased injury rates. German intelligence interpreted female factory workers as unmistakable proof of American desperation. A captured Luftwaffe report dismissed these women as temporary measures, confidently predicting the collapse of quality standards once the novelty wore off. Instead, precision actually improved. Women demonstrated particular aptitude for detailed work, intricate wiring, sensitive instrument inspection, tasks demanding steady hands and meticulous attention. Their integration into the workforce represented democratic strength, not the weakness that Nazi ideology insisted it must be. As American production reached ever higher levels, Germany retreated further into fantasy. Goering authorized the Jägerstab program in February 1944, attempting to disperse aircraft manufacturing across 729 separate underground facilities relying on slave labor. The Mittelwerk complex alone employed 60,000 prisoners under horrific conditions, with 20,000 perishing in the effort. These underground factories produced more defective parts than functioning aircraft. Slave laborers deliberately sabotaged components they were forced to manufacture. Transporting parts between dispersed production facilities created bottlenecks and delays. Quality control systems collapsed entirely. The entire Mittelwerk complex produced fewer aircraft engines monthly than Ford's single Chicago plant. Meanwhile, American innovation only accelerated. Boeing developed B-29 construction using a modular system spread across 4 separate facilities with parts that were completely interchangeable between production locations. The pressurized B-29, which cost $605,000 per unit, incorporated technology that Germany couldn't even achieve in experimental prototypes. By early 1945, America was producing 100 B-29s monthly. D-Day on June 6, 1944, demonstrated the full flowering of American production capacity. The invasion deployed 11,590 Allied aircraft against a German response of just 319 sorties, an overwhelming air superiority ratio of 36-1. This wasn't merely tactical advantage, it represented industrial annihilation made manifest. Between January and May 1944, preparatory bombing campaigns dropped 145,000 tons of ordnance on German targets, a tonnage that exceeded every bomb Germany had dropped on Britain throughout the entire war. Transport aircraft delivered 3 airborne divisions in a single day's operation, using more planes than Germany's entire transport fleet had ever possessed at any point. By December 1944, individual bombing raids involved 1,000 bombers escorted by 900 fighters. P-51 Mustangs possessed the range to reach Poland, the performance to match any opponent they encountered, and existed in numbers so vast that losses became almost irrelevant to operational capability. German pilots gave these Mustangs a bitter nickname, Indians. They swarmed everywhere simultaneously, appearing at moments when German fighters desperately needed altitude advantage or numerical superiority. As Germany's military situation crumbled toward inevitable defeat, even Nazi leadership finally acknowledged the production catastrophe that had determined their fate. In December 1944, Joseph Goebbels wrote in his personal diary, "Goering's promises about Luftwaffe superiority now seem criminal delusions. We are fighting the world's greatest industrial power armed only with rhetoric." Erwin Rommel told his staff before D-Day came, "The Americans can lose 10 tanks for every single one we destroy and still overwhelm us through sheer material replacement. When they land, they will arrive with such overwhelming material superiority that no defensive position can possibly hold." Even Hitler himself, facing the stark reality of impending collapse, admitted to Albert Speer in January 1945, "We should have listened to Bertiger's reports. Their industrial potential was the decisive factor. While we built hundreds, they built tens of thousands." Albert Speer later testified at war's end that American bombing had reduced German production by 35% for tanks, 31% for aircraft, and 42% for trucks. He stated with absolute clarity, the American bombing campaign, which followed a carefully calculated system targeting industrial facilities, caused the complete breakdown of German arms production. Germany's Messerschmitt Me 260U jet fighter, which became operational in mid-1944, represented genuine technological innovation, planes that flew 100 miles per hour, faster than any Allied fighter then in service. Hitler and Goebbels seized on this development as vindication, convinced that this wonder weapon could restore air superiority despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage. Yet Germany managed to produce just 1,430 Mi-22s and 62s across the entire war, never achieving more than 200 operational simultaneously. Jet engines required complete overhauls every 10 hours of operation. Critical materials remained unavailable, forcing substitutions of inferior compounds. America had begun its own jet development program in 1942. The Bell P-59 fell short when measured against German jets, yet Lockheed's P-80 Shooting Star surpassed every enemy fighter and entered manufacturing before the war concluded. America's vast industrial apparatus permitted the simultaneous development of multiple competing technologies, a privilege Germany simply couldn't match. This fundamental difference would ultimately decide everything. Germany possessed superior jet technology, but that advantage dissolved against American capacity to manufacture thousands of conventional aircraft while simultaneously advancing to the next generation. Technical excellence meant nothing when weighed against sheer productive volume. When Hermann Göring faced arrest on May 8, 1945, captured by troops from the U.S. 36th Infantry Division, reality finally caught up with him. At first, he resisted during questioning at an Augsburg interrogation center, insisting that German engineering had proven superior, but was simply overwhelmed by numerical advantage. His transport to Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg changed everything. This special facility housed Nazi high commanders, and the interrogations there grew far more intensive. By July 1945, Major Kenneth Heckler conducted searching interviews that documented Goering's gradual awakening to the truth about American industrial might. "I understood American potential was substantial," Goering conceded to Heckler, "yet what you actually achieved exceeded my darkest calculations. Consider that single plant at Willow Run. It constructed more bombers than our entire Air Force possessed at its peak. The scale was simply incomprehensible." He expressed genuine shock regarding American supply lines and your ability to sustain forces across 2 continents while keeping your own production flowing uninterrupted. "Such a thing lay completely beyond our thinking. We struggled to adequately support armies positioned just 500 miles from Berlin. Yet you maintained armies spanning 5,000 miles from American shores." When prosecutors confronted Goering at his Nuremberg trial with documentation of American production dominance, the evidence proved overwhelming. Charts demonstrated that by 1944, America was producing more aircraft every single month than Germany managed in an entire year. Projection films showed Willow Run's endless assembly lines operating at full capacity, while prosecutors described German towns flattened by bombers manufactured at that very facility. During his March 14, 1946 testimony, Goering's words betrayed his internal struggle with the numbers. "I possessed confidence in America's economic and technical capacity, particularly in aviation. I simply failed to envision such explosive expansion. They increased production 100-fold within just 4 years. This seemed physically impossible to achieve." Prison psychologist G.M. Gilbert observed Goering returning repeatedly to production calculations, obsessively comparing individual American plants against Germany's entire manufacturing base. Willow Run held particular fascination for him. He referred to it as that damned factory that crushed us. When presented with the stark comparison, America had manufactured 812,115 aircraft engines versus Germany's 241,675. Goering lapsed into silent contemplation. The numbers told the story with mathematical finality. What America had accomplished remained almost incomprehensible even in hindsight. The progression proved staggering, from 3,601 military aircraft in 1940 to 295,959 by war's conclusion. Of those final numbers, 97,810 were bombers, 99,465 fighters, and 98,684 other types. Yet production volume represented only the visible portion of something far larger. A systematic superiority across every manufacturing dimension. 2 million Americans staffed aircraft factories at peak capacity, representing a workforce of extraordinary diversity. Women worked alongside men. African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans stood at assembly stations. Disabled workers contributed. Teenagers and senior citizens served essential roles. This democratic mobilization accomplished what dictatorial systems could not. Voluntary participation that outproduced forced labor by every conceivable measure. The workers who entered aircraft factories in 1941 possessed no aviation knowledge whatsoever. 4 years later, they had become the planet's most accomplished aviation manufacturing specialists. These people didn't simply construct aircraft. They fundamentally transformed manufacturing methodology itself. Statistical quality control techniques, pioneered for bomber assembly, became the global industrial standard. Innovations developed at Willow Run's assembly lines would later shape manufacturing worldwide. The engineers who conceived bomber assembly procedures would eventually design the Saturn V rocket. The women who fastened rivets into B-24 fuselages would give birth to children who eventually walked on the moon. Yet victory itself represented merely the beginning. The production triumph launched America's dominant century. The financial dimensions staggered conventional economic understanding. Aircraft manufacturing consumed $45 billion during the 1940s, equivalent to roughly $800 billion in contemporary money. Even the B-29 program's expense dwarfed the Manhattan Project's cost. Rather than draining American resources, wartime production generated unimaginable prosperity. Depression-era unemployment simply vanished. Between 1940 and 1945, worker earnings doubled. War bond purchases by ordinary citizens bankrolled much of the expansion. Workers at Willow Run alone purchased $45 million in bonds, essentially funding their own facilities' operations. Germany faced opposite circumstances. By 1944, the Nazi state consumed 40% of its entire industrial output for aircraft manufacturing, yet produced less than half what America generated. Dependence on enslaved workers proved disastrous. Sabotage was constant. Quality deteriorated rapidly. Strangely, German worker productivity actually dropped after 1943, while American productivity climbed by 300%. The wartime industrial base that emerged would directly enable post-war American economic expansion. Aluminum facilities built to supply bombers converted to producing material for housing developments across America. Chemical refineries that manufactured aviation fuel shifted to creating plastics for household products. Industrial machine tool plants that had equipped aircraft manufacturers retooled themselves, equipping American factories for decades of global commercial supremacy. Manufacturing excellence extended far beyond mere output statistics. The War Production Board orchestrated operations across 184,000 separate companies with remarkable coordination. IBM's punch-card computing systems managed millions of components flowing through thousands of suppliers. Scientists at MIT's radiation laboratory, numbering 4,000 researchers, perfected navigation systems that permitted American bombers to operate effectively regardless of weather conditions. When combat experience revealed that B-17s suffered devastating losses from head-on attacks, Boeing engineering teams designed and introduced chin turrets in just 60 days. When the Pacific Theater demanded extended operational range, consolidated modified B-24s continuously without interrupting production schedules. German engineers required months or years for comparable modifications. American teams accomplished similar work in weeks. This flexibility, this capacity to adapt rapidly, mattered as much as pure manufacturing volume. American aircraft designs evolved constantly, incorporating lessons from distant combat zones. Reports from Pacific battles reached production facilities in the Atlantic within just days. German aircraft, constructed within concealed underground factories by coerced workers, underwent no meaningful evolution, while American designs improved weekly. The system created an extraordinary feedback mechanism. Combat pilots reported observations that reached design engineers immediately. Engineers transmitted solutions to assembly line supervisors within mere days. Assembly line employees submitted suggestions that traveled directly to the engineering departments. This open flow of information, this democratic sharing of knowledge, proved decisively superior to German rigid hierarchical structures. Hours before his scheduled execution on October 15, 1946, Hermann Göring composed what would be his final correspondence. In that letter, he delivered his ultimate pronouncement regarding the production struggle's meaning. The Americans triumphed through manufacturing strength, not battlefield superiority. We didn't fall to more valiant soldiers, but to more powerful factories. The nation you dismissed as fit only for manufacturing consumer merchandise entombed us beneath millions of tons of aluminum and steel. His concluding remark to psychologist Gilbert carried similar weight. We unleashed warfare against an industrial power that hadn't yet awakened. When it finally stirred, our destruction became inevitable. They didn't simply manufacture greater quantities. They fundamentally reinvented manufacturing itself. Every dimension of their system demonstrated superiority to ours. That evening, Göring took his own life, yet his final words endure as history's judgment on the production conflict. The former commander-in-chief, who once dismissed American potential, died aware that a single American factory had exceeded his entire Air Force's cumulative output over the entire war. Modern military scholars identify American manufacturing supremacy as the determining element in Allied victory. Without the overwhelming material advantage provided by production, the Normandy invasion could never have succeeded, sustained bombing campaigns could never have continued, and victory in the Pacific would have remained impossible. Richard Overy, the preeminent historian examining the air war, determined that material weight, not combat heroism or tactical cleverness, ultimately proved decisive. The Allies prevailed because they buried adversaries beneath mountains of manufactured goods. The statistics leave no room for argument. By 1944, America independently was producing more military aircraft than every other nation combined, including all Allied powers. This represented not merely superior performance, but a difference of magnitude so vast it became overwhelming. Germany confronted not simple defeat, but complete annihilation. Yet this manufacturing marvel possessed significance extending far beyond military triumph. It validated democracy's fundamental superiority over autocracy, demonstrated liberty's advantage over oppression, showcased voluntary participation's power over forced compliance. The workers who executed this transformation weren't enslaved subjects or conscripted masses, but independent citizens bound by shared determination. Göring's contempt for American productive strength represents history's most catastrophic miscalculation. His dismissal of democratic manufacturing capacity cost his nation the war and countless millions of lives. His refusal to acknowledge American capabilities sealed Nazi Germany's doom long before the first bombs fell on German territory. The evolution from 3,000 to 100,000 aircraft produced yearly proved that free societies, when confronting mortal danger, could perform miracles. American workers didn't merely fulfill Roosevelt's ambitious production targets, they doubled them. They didn't merely match German output, they exceeded it fivefold while simultaneously deploying forces across the Pacific. Contemporary leaders should heed Göring's miscalculation, underestimating peaceful democracies as fundamentally weak, dismissing free people's productive capacity because they prioritize prosperity over conquest, carries tremendous risk of catastrophic error. America appeared unprepared for conflict in 1940. By 1944, it had transformed into an unstoppable manufacturing force. Democracy's arsenal demonstrated that factory floors could prove as vital as battlefields, that production workers could matter as much as combat troops, that industrial mobilization could determine outcomes as decisively as military tactics. Göring comprehended this reality only when it arrived too late, when his nation lay in complete ruin. From his dismissive response to Roosevelt's May 1940 announcement through his October 1946 execution at Nuremberg, Göring's personal trajectory mirrored Nazi Germany's collapse. His contempt for American production became the Nazi regime's final epitaph, a system that elevated ideology above capability, believed tyranny represented strength, and imagined racial doctrine could overcome industrial mathematics. The Reichsmarshal who dismissed American aircraft manufacturing died knowing American factories had produced more planes in 1944 alone than his entire nation managed across the whole war. His ridicule of democratic manufacturing became history's most expensive miscalculation, resolved through complete military defeat. America manufactured 295,959 military aircraft. Germany produced 94,677. Yet the authentic triumph rested not in raw quantity, but in approach. Proving enslaved workforces couldn't match free laborers, authoritarian commands couldn't match democratic participation. A nation assembled from immigrants and countless cultures could unite accomplishing the extraordinary. B-24 bombers departing Willow Run's assembly lines every hour and 3 minutes represented far more than mere weapons. They embodied democracy's response to tyranny, each fastener secured by a woman who had worked as a housewife mere months prior, each engine produced by a teenager fresh from abandoning high school, each wing section assembled by laborers who had fled destitution and prejudice, all demonstrated that liberated peoples, when committed to righteous purpose, could overwhelm tyranny under waves of manufactured goods. Göring dismissed the notion of America producing 50,000 planes yearly. America answered by manufacturing twice that quantity, fundamentally altering world history through that response. His mockery persists through the centuries as the sound of fatal miscalculation, the fatal underestimation of democracy's productive capacity by someone who understood neither democratic systems nor production itself. Ultimately, more than 300,000 aircraft buried both him and everything his ideology represented under sheer volume. converting his scorn into humanity's most total defeat.